Is Sylvie the new Time Lord? Who actually lived on those timelines? And according to Obi, the TVA is in big trouble because...
Well, I'm gonna die!
Salutations and fist bumps, folks. Welcome back to The Grid. We have a lot to talk about and no time to waste. Let's ride. As the episode opens, we exit a time door with Mobius and Loki in deep conversation. We hear them discussing whether or not Sylvie is in the place where they just traveled to, because Loki mentions that the place that they are currently in is not an apocalypse. But from what we saw in the post-credit scenes from episode 1, it looks like Sylvie is no longer hiding in those events anymore, because now she wants to experience the timeline as she sees it instead of hide inside of it. And we can see from the timestamp that this is actually a place on the actual sacred timeline. To the left of them, we can see an earlier version of the Daily Inquirer. And to the right as they walk, you can see one of Kango's movie posters, meaning that the Eternals have some kind of semblance here inside of this part of the sacred timeline. And then we hear Mobius say that they got a hit from X5's TemPad, which brought them to this location. The same X5 that we saw huddling close and walking with General Dox in the last episode. And we hear Mobius actually explain that the TemPad has actually gone dark, which to me possibly happened when the extra gadgets were added to the TemPad to explain where or what is going on with X5. We then see the shot from the trailer which shows X5 as Brad Wolfe starring in Zaniac. And if you don't know who Zaniac is, a little bit of a brief history on him from the comics. An entity from the dark dimension that would take hold of a host, causing them to develop an overwhelming bloodthirst and desire to do harmful things to women. Hence the woman running away from him inside of the movie poster. Zaniac appears for the very first time in comics inside of Thor 3:19. He is played both in the comics and inside of this series by Brad Wolfe, an actor who came into contact with the actual Zaniac through a freak accident. As Brad gets out of his limo, we hear a 70s styled version of the Loki theme song as he greets the entirety of the people around him. So this begs a question for me: is or was this X5's life on the timeline before? But then again, there's this line too.
How do you feel about your meteoric rise to fame?
Which means he just got started. We then hear a reporter name drop Bridget Bardot when asking if Brad is possibly dating her. Bridget, a popular 70s star, possibly would have been around this type of event inside of this era. So adding this wrinkle gives a little bit more credence to this particular space inside of the timeline. Brad then tries to play off the fact that he is completely taken off or thrown off by the fact that Mobius is even there. Specifically pointed out by the fact that he does the awkward, "Hey man, how are you? How you doing? It's been a long time since I saw you." And as Mobius and Loki corner him, he thinks quickly on his feet, offering drinks to both Mobius and Loki, which Mobius actually takes and is glossed over by, but Loki, not so much. We then hear B-15 ask for Brad's autograph, and the attire that she is wearing is very similar to what she would have been wearing in Lovecraft Country. But in the encounter with Brad, she actually gets the chance to take the TemPad. But we'll get more into that later on in the video. Loki then blasts Brad down a flight of stairs, asking him, "Are you still glad to see us?" We then hear Brad say, "You quit with the magic and fight fair," which to me was kind of interesting that Loki has his powers on the sacred timeline, but not inside the TVA, even though it is completely dismantled at this point. We also then get glimpses of comic accurate Loki from the shadows that appear behind Brad, which the sleight of hand actually tricks Mobius even when he thinks that the trick is a little bit over the top, talking to one of the duplicates of Loki. Loki notices Brad's collar, which he makes a remark that those are kind of tight, aren't they? Which to me seems like a way of calling back his own experience in episode 1 when he was first brought in to the TVA. B-15 then asks about the TemPad, to which Brad responds and says that he put some colorful buttons on it for them. But those buttons are actually large computer modules that, again, don't block a signal at all. What? And in this conversation, we hear B-15 say that they should take this TemPad down to OB to have it checked out. When Loki asks how everything is going, OB answers the question saying,
"The loom is in rough shape, but I'm trying to figure out a retrofit device to handle all those new branches."
And to Mobius, that means that he's got everything covered. That's not exactly what he was saying. Because of that wire getting crossed, Mobius believes that it is okay for him to ask his question about the TemPad. OB's response to Mobius is basically, read the manual, genius. Because OB has a very high functioning level of engineering brain, and after he's started on a particular project, he doesn't want to start on a different one. So he's basically telling them, which is what a lot of engineers would actually do, read the freaking manual. We head through a time door where you can fist bump that like button for me if this is being helpful so far. And if any of my theories are actually getting you to think about some stuff, share this with a friend. Thank you for doing that. Let's get back to it. B-15 then asks Casey about the whereabouts of Renslayer, to which Casey believes is a secret at the moment. But B-15's response to that is, why are you whispering? Absolutely classic. B-15 then explains to him that because of the events that she has done, everything that is going on in terms of Ravonna is not a secret, and we need to find her right now. And in this exchange, we actually get confirmation that Renslayer did in fact kill C-20 in season 1. Casey then makes mention that traces are being ran, but because of the nature of the TVA currently, everything has to be ran manually. Because also Miss Minutes is completely out of the picture as well. And he is also able to pinpoint the fact that the last person to send a message to Renslayer was Miss Minutes, because if you remember back in episode 6, she was downloading files to Renslayer's TemPad and then was the only person that Renslayer had contact with in terms of her TemPad before she actually went through the time door. And for me, a fan moment that I just love seeing over and over and over again is the banter that happens between Loki and Mobius is always just fun to see on screen, and I want more of it usually, because it shows the frustration that builds up as they are working on this TemPad, and it also flies in the face of them both as Casey comes over and basically tells them that what they're trying to do is not actually going to work. Then Casey confirms all of the suspicions that I had about Ravonna and Miss Minutes in terms of them working together, because it's revealed that she is working with Miss Minutes. And if you remember from my episode 1 breakdown, it's possible that she could be an earlier version of Miss Minutes before she was actually digitized. But this now also enlightens Mobius on why he couldn't get in contact with Miss Minutes. Loki then remembers the tape recording that he heard from He Who Remains and Ravonna, mentioning that it sounded like they were partners, which if it stays true to form, it comes from their relationship from the comic. But Hunter B-15 has had enough of Ravonna.
She really is full of surprises.
Because to me, it sounded like she wanted to say a little bit something else inside of that. And Mobius is,
you can say that again,
feels fully loaded as well because of his last encounter with his former friend. Off to the side, you can see Loki fiddling around with the TemPad as if he has never seen or touched a computer in his life. Casey and B-15's faces were me when I initially saw him fiddling with this, like, sir, what exactly are you doing? Casey then jumps in, noticing the way that they are struggling with that TemPad, and pulls rank for the first time when he says,
"That's not what it does."
Which again is the first time that we've seen this type of swag from Casey, understanding his abilities and being very confident in what he can do. And as Casey rattles off his genius plan on how to rectify and find out what the TemPad actually does, and if you look at B-15's face, her face basically says, my guy, where has this energy been the entire time? We then head back to meet up with old Brad. And in this intersection of conversation, it seems like the writers are pushing the envelope at Marvel a little bit. I know we just came off the strike, but again, based on what is in this script, it seems like the writers are trying to push the envelope just a little bit ahead of Deadpool, because some of the language used inside of this sequence is a little bit more than we've seen inside of Disney Plus series from before. And at this point, we can now officially stop calling X5 X5, and we are going to start calling him X5 Brad, because he establishes that his name is Brad.
His mama named him Clay. I'm gonna call him Clay.
And in this conversation, Brad then brings up the fact that B-15 was so adamant about lives on the timeline because of their previous encounter inside of the war room. Also, notice in the background that this would most likely be Time Theater number 7, which Loki was actually held in Time Theater number 5 when he was initially brought into the TVA. Brad then tries to rustle Loki's feathers when telling him that he's not necessarily a hero, more of a villain, and he should stay that way. Mobius then tries to break this up because by his face you can tell that he's feeling a little guilty because he said the exact same things to Loki.
Time Twister just loops you, not the furniture. You weren't born to be king, Loki. You were born to cause pain and suffering and death. That's how it is, that's how it was, that's how it will be.
Yep, that's definitely the face of a guilty man. The shame.
Brad then makes mention that Loki makes everything worse for everyone around him, including his mother, who died because of instructions that he gave to the enemy of Asgard inside of Thor 2. Brad then also makes another point inside of this discussion: is Loki a better villain or hero? What do you guys think? Leave that down in the comments. In the speech given by Loki directly after this conversation, Loki does acknowledge the shortcomings of his past. And as he does this, he starts to zero in on Brad, playing up the villain card a little bit more. So much so that Mobius is actually convinced of the same thing. And as Loki gets closer to Brad, it looks like, at least from the way that he was moving his hands, it looked like he was about to get the chokehold of Mischief. Cooler heads would prevail, but then Brad turns his sights to Mobius, who then slaps him.
Where's the 5 fingers? Say to the face. What? Slap.
But there's one thing I want to point out about this particular part of the conversation between Mobius and Brad. This is the second time in this series that X5 Brad has now questioned Mobius's time on the timeline. But Mobius denies that he was anything other than a TVA analyst. But if you go back to the earlier conversation, I'm almost certain that Mobius used to be, or still kind of is, a jet ski salesman. But there's more that could be coming with Mobius in terms of what we see in the ending of this episode, and that's coming later on in the video.
And X5 Brad definitely struck a chord with old Mobius.
Yes, he did, Little Cap. Mobius and Loki are then seen traveling down a hallway which looks like the hallway or the same hallway that Obi's lab is connected to. But in the hallway to Obi's lab, the file cabinets have previously used canisters for work orders lying everywhere. But these file cabinets are mostly closed, so this effectively is a new place or area inside of the TVA that we've never seen before, except for the staircase that we initially see in this scene that comes from the credit. And the location that Mobius and Loki ended up in is called an Automat. An Automat is a fast food restaurant which typically has simple food and drinks inside of it using a vending machine, which typically doesn't have any waitstaff at all. And with this in mind, the poster to the right of Loki makes more sense to be there, saying that an individual can have one slice of pie and one slice only, and that bartering is strictly forbidden. The poster to the left of Mobius can be seen later on in the sequence and is shown to instruct employees to bring their own cups. And the exchange between Loki and Mobius is just so them.
It's really good.
I don't know how to explain it, but I could watch it all day, which starts from Mobius trying to justify the way that they got into that room in the first place when he was clearly leading in front, to him also acting like there were more selections of pie than just key lime in the first place.
How about a slice of pie? Key lime.
And that's all there is. There isn't any more.
Mobius then brings up the fact that he lost it in the altercation moments before, which is ironic because you would think that Loki would be the person flying off the hinge in that scenario, given his previous track record. But Loki actually comforts him, and in his statement about the altercation, he actually changes or adds more color to some MCU history, because Loki says that he came down to Earth, specifically to New York City, because he was very angry at his father and his brother. But it was originally thought that he teamed up with Thanos because that was the only thing that he could possibly do. Then Loki pokes at Mobius's timeline wound a little bit more. Mobius says that he doesn't want to remember anything about his time inside of the sacred timeline because what if it was good? And he doesn't want that rattling inside of his brain because bad things he could just leave at the wayside. He even says,
"Because it's not my life, but it could have been. It isn't."
We then hear the inner workings of the plan that would later be used to find the location of Sylvie, because Loki and Mobius understand that X5 Brad wants to keep his life on the timeline, which is possibly something that he had been striving at for a long time in his actual life. So when he gets access to it, he doesn't really want to let it go, even if that means turning away from bringing Sylvie into the TVA. However, we find out later that what he possibly did was set a charge on the timeline branch that Sylvie is in, then bailed for a different one, for the one that we saw him in the beginning of the episode, with his enhanced temp pad showing General Dox where he actually is, so she doesn't blow that branch up. We then see Obi heading down to the temporal core area with what looks like a new extractor. And we also get another subtle nod to the X-Men from the doors. As Obi attaches the extractor to the control board, we see the room go dark. And then we get the warning from the credits, which now can be fully read as warning, access denied, invalid temporal aura. And the use of the word aura here means or suggests that the machine has been synced to a person or a being. As Loki enters the room where X5 Brad is being held, the music adds a little bit more punch to the scene, telling the audience that what is about to happen here is very pivotal, as if to suggest that the actions coming here in this scene will further the story along drastically, which is carried through all the way until Mobius hits the door with the truth machine. Then, at least what stood out to me, X5 Brad asks where B-15 is for two reasons. One, he wants to find out where this order actually came from. And two, he wants to find out if this is just a mind trick between Loki and Mobius, because he knows that Loki doesn't understand how to actually use the machine. Loki then presses Brad, or X5 Brad as we're calling him in this video, for the location of Sylvie. And as he does, the answers that Brad continues to give poke more and more holes in the plan for General Dox. And in this moment, Loki then calls back to the earlier conversation that X5 Brad had to him about being a villain, which now he is not very happy about having that particular conversation anymore, because he does not want Loki to choose violence in this particular scenario at all, because it can and would kill him. He even says it directly to Loki inside of this moment.
I covered this thing, right? Yeah, there is a learning curve. You know, you could kill me with that. Could I?
By the face that Loki makes after he says this adds to the fire that Loki was brewing in the first place. Also, on the other side of the door, Mobius can be heard saying this wasn't the type of mischief that I was talking about, going back to the conversation made earlier over pie. And after a bit of torture for a while, Loki actually finally gets the answers that he was looking for, letting X5 Brad and the audience then in on the idea or the plan that they had cooked up to get the location that they were looking for. And in the information gathered from X5 Brad, we now understand that what we saw in the end credit inside of episode 1 was Sylvie heading into a new life, because at this point she is on the search for the life that she never got the chance to live. We cut to another X-Men door reference with B-15 and Casey standing behind it. And as the door opens and they walk in, we hear Obi in the background saying, and though the nature of this line is actually serious, the way that Ke-Huy Quan actually says it is hilarious. And even when he meets Casey for the first time, he doesn't change at all.
We're all gonna die! Oh, hey, nice to meet you. We're all gonna die.
But in this sequence, we finally get the chance to see how smart Casey actually is. And me personally, I'm glad they started to open up his character a little bit more from what we saw in season 1. Here, he's a lot more computer wizard than anything, and in some circles, that is an actual superpower. But in this exchange, Casey actually gets to meet his very own version of a superhero to him when he finds out that Obi, or Boris, is actually the father of the TVA handbook, which he has actually read and pretty much memorized at this point, which is what Mobius said that he hasn't done yet. Casey gets to the point where he actually starts fanboying and asks for Obi's autograph. But this shows just how hidden Obi has actually been, because we've known about Casey for the majority of this series, and Obi, at least from what we've known inside of this series so far in episode 1, has been around for 400 plus years. And both of them have literally been in the same building over a span of however long Casey has actually been there, and they have never crossed paths. And I love the moment that they gave Obi in terms of Casey giving Obi his flowers because of the work that he's done inside of the TVA and keeping it afloat pretty much in terms of all the engineering. Then B-15 jumps in, bringing them both back down to Earth, which then prompts Obi to explain the information or the warning that he just received, saying that the issue is that the designer is the only person that can open the blast doors once they come fully down, because the doors can only be opened with a live version of their temporal aura, or in other words, their spirit. However, it is also safe to say that a stand-in could be used if they were present, which to me would also mean that they were present during the creation process of the TVA as well. And I'm gathering this by Obi's statement about Miss Minute. We then head to the branch that Brad expected Sylvie to be on. And on the McDonald's sign, we can see the slogan 40 billion served, which actually changed over multiple different stores and years and has now changed from an actual number to billions and billions being served instead of showing or displaying a specific number. And at one point, I believe it used to say 99 billion or something like that and counting. We also then again see the city of Bruxton, Oklahoma, which is significant to the Thor comic series. We can also see that we are no longer on the sacred timeline, which is different from what we saw in the beginning of the episode when we were chasing down Brad. And speaking of Brad, X5 Brad is showing big signs that there is way more going on than he is actually letting on in terms of why he wants to go back to the TVA so much, based on how jumpy he actually is, and Mobius calls it out.
Wait, why are you so jumpy? It's making me nervous.
Which X5 Brad tries to explain away, and his explanation sounds good, but my BS meter was going off the entire time. And then when we head into the restaurant, we see Sylvie's interaction with customers, or at least we hear it.
Bill, orders up.
Thanks, Sylvie. And we understand that she has now become a regular at this particular restaurant, and she has a relationship with her customers, understanding them and knowing them by name. And when Loki and Sylvie lock eyes in the aftermath of their kiss that they shared at the end of episode 6, which now is 2 episodes ago at this point, we can see that they have some tension and some things that they need to get off their chest. There are a lot of different emotions here that just haven't been processed yet. X5 Brad shows signs again that something ain't right when he tries to get Mobius again to head back to the TVA. But Mobius says that he isn't leaving until he gets some of that sweet 1980s apple pie from McDonald's. But hold up, how does he know about apple pie? Wasn't this the same man just moments earlier saying that he didn't want to know or didn't need to know anything about his life on the timeline? And especially he didn't want to know about the good things on the timeline, because if he did, he would want to go back. So if you've had that apple pie before they changed the recipe, I should say, if you've had that apple pie, you know that that's a part of the good stuff inside of the timeline. So how does he know about apple pie? Well, one way he could know is, could he possibly be the guy that Sylvie has been talking to inside of McDonald's since she got there? And to add to this, X5 Brad actually says that his name is not Mobius. And when they first come into the restaurant, we don't get a glimpse of him and Mobius locking eyes. So they never actually see each other inside of that sequence. So is it safe to say that this could be Mobius on the timeline? Loki and Sylvie then have their heart-to-heart, opening with the fact that Sylvie still doesn't trust Loki because she believes that he wants to take over the place of He Who Remains.
The cost of getting this wrong is too great. Fine. Do it! Kill me! Take your throne!
And then we hear the promo lines that were littered through all of the trailer.
I've been pulled through time.
And as I was expecting, he is in this moment when he says that talking to Sylvie, which I suspected inside of my trailer breakdown video. And in this exchange, he is also describing time slipping as well. Sylvie says, "You can see the future now." Cool. After Loki describes seeing her in the future after time slipping to the future inside of the TVA. And her remark seems like a play on the fact that her enchanting allows her to see the past, which in a way adds to the mirror effect of their dynamic. And Sylvie confirms what I was expecting earlier about her not wanting to go back into apocalypses anymore, because she says that she's happy and she wants to live and she wants to actually experience the life of the timeline instead of just hiding inside of it. Sylvie then makes mention to the fact that the future hasn't been written or isn't being written currently because of her actions, what she just did in episode 6, which actually is in direct opposition to what He Who Remains said in episode 6 as well. Loki continues to plead with Sylvie to get her to understand that what is going on is much bigger than the TVA, but on a much, much larger scale. Keep in mind though, Sylvie's perspective is limited in nature because she only understands time hopping, and when she did that, she was usually living on the edges of time in general anyway. Then we hear Mobius say to X5 Brad that I thought you were about to set us up for an ambush.
And boy, was he close to the smoking gun on that one.
In this little exchange, we see him enjoying his apple pie. And the conversation between X5 and Mobius is seemingly friendly. Mobius even actually apologizes to him, and he actually buys him a shake, which is actually when the machines consistently work. Then X5 Brad asks about the relationship between Sylvie and Loki, to which Mobius explains that this is kind of hard to explain, especially when you're in a relationship with yourself. And this may be a stretch still, but take a look at the positioning from the guy from the counter and Mobius. The way that this is shot, it seems like it's being said that he is the past version of Mobius. All of this happened in 10 minutes? And oh, by the way, do y'all remember those weird, scary trees they tried to put in the play areas for the kids? Whose idea was that? But then we hear Mobius start putting 2 and 2 together. If you pay attention to X5 Brad as Mobius comes to the realization that this actually is a setup, you can understand how the words that Mobius is saying start to hit X5, and his face literally changes from "oh, I'm cool" to "uh-oh," because the mission is now compromised for General Dox and he was the decoy. And before X5 Brad shares his big news, we hear an exchange between Sylvie and Loki where Sylvie believes that she is the new time holder and has enough confidence in her abilities that if variants start to show up of He Who Remains, she could kill him. Though at this moment she has only had one frame of reference He Who Remains at this point, and that was not the full powered version of Kang that she went against. Then X5 Brad goes on a whole tangent scaring all of the nice customers going into the restaurant, which Sylvie then enchants, showing us the final battle scene that we see later on. And we find out that the plan, as I suspected in my last video, that the idea for General Dox is to destroy the entirety of all of the branches of the timeline. Upon finding this out, Mobius then sends X5 Brad right back to the TVA, which is where he wanted to go in the first place. And we can now see all of the charges General Dox has now set on the timeline inside of the monitoring area. Now, in terms of production value, as we head into the battle room, the transition from the previous scene in through the time door into the battle scene was incredible, which actually is something that I had to slow down in order to figure out what was going on inside of this transition. But the gang starts knocking heads and taking names as Sylvie and Loki are able to come together for a final blast at the machine. And during the final blast, you can see General Dox crouched behind the actual console of the machine. However, the early discussion on the battlefield shows or depicts the reasons for all of the time doors, which are basically connected to the main central hub that General Dox is manning, which this control panel probably also has the ability to see enhanced temp pads, which is why X5 was able to be seen by General Dox, or at least that's what I'm believing, so that he would not be taken out inside of her plan. And we can see inside of this fight that pruning still has some kind of effect. But the question is, does it have the same effect that it had before the TVA went haywire, or does it send you to somewhere completely different when you are pruned? We head back into the TVA through a time door which is given to us, or which was first seen inside of trailers for the show. And as we come back into the monitoring area, we see that all of the timeline branches have now been destroyed. Now, given the fact that we just established these timelines, I have a few questions that I need answers to. Number one, in terms of the people that B-15 keeps talking about inside of this series, have we met any of them? Moreover, are all of the branches and people that she is talking away just plot people that we necessarily don't really care about, but we have to have them in the story to move it along? Or were people like Steve Rogers on one or all of those timelines as well, which, by the way, again, are now gone. 2, does this now mean that we only have a sacred timeline at this point? And if that is the case, where is Sylvie actually resting at the end of the episode? And 3, it is shown that Sylvie now has the temp pad of He Who Remains. So does that allow her to jump into previous timeline branches that were actually destroyed before, or does she have the ability to recreate them? And we also now know where Ravonna is, because what is shown from Casey's trace is that she is on the timeline in a specific branch. Her location looks like a TVA version of an IP address, which would make sense because that would be an easy way to keep track of where temp pads fly in and out of timelines on. And the 4th sequence in the numbers has 4 total numbers, something possibly useful for adding more context to which branch you're actually on inside of the timeline. Then Loki and Sylvie's discussion gives us one of the most heartfelt lines of this episode, possibly even the entire series. It's harder to stay, which is very true, both in life and in this episode. It's harder to stand in front of things than it would be to run from them. And we can see the juxtaposition of choices being made by Loki and Sylvie. As Sylvie decides to go through the time door, Loki decides to turn back and face what's going on. Sylvie then talks to her coworker, again asking him if his mom is coming to pick him up, which feels like a motherly line, but given what Sylvie just saw, it could be a more loaded question based on what we previously talked about in terms of who this could be later on. Because again, I must iterate, Jack seems like an earlier version of Mobius. You know, the fact that she has that temp pad means that we could be looking at